Hello, and a warm welcome to our course on close reading Shakespeare's Macbeth. I'm Edward Dunnigan, partnering with the Bund Education. Today, in our first lesson on Shakespeare's Macbeth, we're going to be focusing on laying the foundations for the more sophisticated and analytical reading of the text that we're going to be performing later on in our course. Remember, these early lessons are important because everything we do later in the course is going to build on the foundations we set today. So specifically, we're going to be attempting to answer three important questions to set up our reading of Macbeth. First, who is William Shakespeare and what is his literary significance? Number two, how can today's students understand Shakespeare's language? Right? And thirdly, to what literary period does Shakespeare's body of work belong? Let's go ahead and let's get started. So first of all, who is William Shakespeare? Right? First of all, we believe that William Shakespeare was born in 1564. Okay? By the way, this is referred to as the 16th century, right? Our present age would be the 21st century. So if you hear me refer to the 16th century, I mean the 1500s, and the 17th century, I mean the 1600s. We know that he was born in Stratford, a town on the River Avon, and we know this from his baptismal records, which are a kind of church record, right? His family, like all English people at the time, would have belonged to a certain church, and they kept records when babies were baptized, when they were very young, a little while after being born. So 1564 is when we assume Shakespeare to have been born. And this period is during the English Golden Age, or the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And we're going to be talking about Queen Elizabeth and her significance a little bit later today and in our second section. Shakespeare was an actor first and foremost, right? So drama, right, which is, dramatic literature, including plays and tragedies and comedies, as we're going to see, and the theater were very important and very popular in Shakespeare's day, and he played an important role in making them even more popular. And the acting company that he belonged to was called the Chamberlain's Men. What's interesting is that the Chamberlain's Men became so popular that they were recognized by Elizabeth I. And when she died, the next King of England, James I, he actually officially sponsored the Chamberlain's Men, and they became known as the King's Men. Right? So he was a hugely successful actor, and he wrote many of the plays that his company acted and performed. Shakespeare is considered by many to be both the greatest poet and the greatest playwright of the English language. Now, first of all, it's a little bit silly for us to try to answer the question, who's the greatest when we're talking about the arts, right? When you're talking about who the greatest basketball player is, you can look at the number of points the person scored and how many wins. But when you're looking at the arts, like literature, it's harder to objectively measure greatness. So I'm not trying to stand here today and say that Shakespeare is definitely the greatest, but the fact that his name comes up in this conversation, not only for drama, but also for poetry, is a good indication that he has had a lasting significance on English literature and really world literature. And that's part of the reason why we're here today studying Macbeth. In order for us to appreciate the significance of Macbeth, we need to know a little bit about the broader range of Shakespeare's body of work. And Shakespeare was indeed a prolific author, right? Prolific meaning he produced a great body of work in his lifetime. There's a little bit of debate about which plays we know for certain Shakespeare wrote. Because, of course, in the 16th century, the publishing industry was not quite as formalized as it is today. Okay? But scholars generally agree that there are 17 comedies, 10 tragedies, 10 histories, 154 sonnets, and 3 longer narrative poems that were written by Shakespeare. Now, Macbeth is considered a tragedy. And in order to understand what that means, let's take a second to give a simple definition of tragedy, comedy, and history. It's hard to give an exact definition of a Shakespearean comedy, but they have a couple of features in common. And we're going to use a popular Shakespearean comedy called The Merchant of Venice as an example. So in The Merchant of Venice, you have a character, Antonio, who is a merchant. And
Antonio gets in a lot of trouble because he takes a loan
from an individual named Shylock in order for him to make an investment in his business. And because of a major storm that destroys his ships, he's not able to pay back that loan. Okay? And part of the terms of the loan involves him dying for the sake of simplicity, he will have part of his body removed by Shylock. So
It looks like Antonio.
really rich merchant, he's in love, he seems handsome and popular, but then because of this bad business deal, his life plummets for the worse. And the audience gets really nervous.
What's going to happen to Antonio?
He's the hero of the story. And luckily, everything works out, and Mercutio ends up being saved in a dramatic court trial, and in the end, he ends up getting married, right? So the structure of a comedy involves a character kind of starting out here, they get into trouble, but in the end, they're saved, and usually in Shakespeare, it ends with a marriage. So comedies have a happy ending, right? Tragedies, on the other hand, are the opposite, right? So as we're going to see in Macbeth, we have a character who is a general. He seems as if his life is on the rise. He's fated to become king of Scotland, right? So he commits some terrible deeds, but he becomes king of Scotland. It seems like he has everything he wants. But due to a number of circumstances that we're going to examine closely in our course together, everything goes wrong for him. And by the end, he goes from his high position as king down to death, right? And he dies, and his wife dies, and everything is terrible for him. So a dramatic story arc looks more like this. You have a character. It seems like things are going well for this character, but then things go horribly wrong, and it doesn't end in marriage. Instead, it ends in death, right? So a tragedy has a sad ending, right? And of course, there are more sophisticated definitions, but this will give us a sense. And finally, if we want to ask what is a history, well, a history is hard to define, but for Shakespeare, histories always tell the stories of the English kings, right? For example, Henry VIII, right? Or Richard II, okay? And even plays that deal with historical subjects, like Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, if they're not about English kings, they don't end up being classified as histories. Okay, so just a sense, Shakespeare's Macbeth is definitely a tragedy. We definitely chart it on this red course, and we're going to analyze the arc of that story as such. One other point I want to make about Shakespeare has to do with collaboration. So many times in Shakespeare's day, there would have been a script that he wrote that the actors in his company performed. And sometimes the play would become so popular that people would pirate the script, right? Right? They would, in other words, write down the words and create a copy of the play that was illegal, right? Or not officially recognized by Shakespeare himself, okay? And this copy would maybe influence the way that the play was printed later on. So a lot of the final editions of Shakespeare's plays, they're not the editions that he himself wrote and gave to the publisher. He wrote many of his plays to be acted rather than to be read, right? So we may see the influence of some editors or some transcribers in some of his plays. And we're going to take a look at, a little bit later, the most final edition of Shakespeare's plays, which is the 1623 First Folio. But one final comment I want to make is that throughout the years, some people have tried to argue that Shakespeare himself did not write his plays. And I really want to emphatically say that these people are wrong. These people are called anti-Stratfordians. I recommend that you don't take any arguments that Francis Bacon or Edward de Vere wrote these plays seriously, right? There may be some collaboration on some of the plays. There may be the work of some editors and publishers, but Shakespeare was a real person, and Shakespeare really did write these plays. Okay, so a note on the First Folio. Macbeth is not published until 1623. As we're going to see, we believe Macbeth is first staged in 1606. Okay, and in the First Folio, right? First Folio is what this text is called, the comedies, histories, and tragedies. Macbeth is firmly situated in the section on tragedies. Okay, the folio contained 36 plays, and 15 of them had been printed previously, but Macbeth had not been printed previously. And there are some inconsistencies between different editions of some of the plays. Some of these plays that had been printed previously, there were little changes from their earlier printings and the first folio printing. So scholars today, when they print a Shakespearean play, they need to look at different editions of the play and make choices about which edition is closest to the authentic version that Shakespeare produced. But ultimately, there are little inconsistencies between the texts, and that's why I recommend that you use the version of the text, the Signet Classic, that I recommended earlier.